in custody, then bail should be granted. The essence, of course, as you would all know, is the balancing of two conflicting interests. On one side, you have the presumption of innocence that the accused is entitled to because his guilt has not been established. On the other hand, we have the state's interest in public order, in protecting the investigation, in protecting the witnesses, in protecting the society. So every bail order would reflect this delicate balancing of two conflicting interests, whether you go in for presumption of innocence or you go in for the state's interest in a given case. And all of this balancing is done in light of Article 21. Every bail order has to be an order which can be justified on the test of due process. Denial of bail can never be punitive or as punishment or as disapproval, because at the stage of bail, we are only examining the case in broad merits, in a broad brush, and not meticulously testing evidence. It is not a trial before trial, as you all aware. Moving on, what is the genesis of the concept of bail? So I tried, looking at how bail really started off. The concept of bail wasn't really needed when we had the times of instant justice. If we go down the history books a couple of thousand years back, we had uh, ordeal by fire, trial by fire, and concepts such as those, where a person would be arrested and then, for example, he would be made to walk on coal, and after that, it would be seen if his feet get burnt, then he's done the offense, and if he doesn't get burnt on the soles of his feet, it is considered that he's innocent. So we've had various different ways of judicial decision making. There was another way in which guilt used to be decided thousands of years back. For example, in one case, a person accused of theft, for example, used to be thrown into a well after tying his hands and legs. And if the person continues to float, then the person was guilty because it was considered the goddess of water has rejected the person and not embraced the person. And if the person who's been thrown into the well, the accused, sinks to the bottom, it is considered that he's innocent because the goddess of water has accepted. The point that I'm trying to make is that in trials such as those where you have instant justice, you do not need the concept of bail because you are deciding guilt and acquittal then and there. The concept of bail becomes important when we have a prolonged trial, when we have a sophisticated trial such as we do now. The first instance of bail coming up is in the 7th century. For the first time, it was have somebody who's an accused, you can release that person on bail. Uh, then we have Magna Carta in the 13th century, which was the first document which provided for personal liberty, rule of law, and bail. Then we had the Statute of Westminster, 1275, which for the first time made a distinction between bailable and non-bailable offences. And in cases which were non-bailable, as a matter of fact, it's quite funny. The accused would be kept because there were no separate prisons for under trials. At that time, the accused used to be kept at the sheriff's house or the investigating officer's house during the course of trial because there was no place to keep the under trials. And that obviously led to a lot of problems where the investigating officer would have to keep the accused with him in his house. That was also changed gradually. Then we had the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. We had the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, where for the first time, remedy was given to people unlawfully detained, and then the Eighth Amendment to the US Constitution. So that's the broad setting in which we are looking at the concept of bail. Uh, there are two types of offenses, as we all know. Bailable offenses, which are shown to be bailable, where bail is granted as a matter of right. Then we have non-bailable offenses, where it is a matter of discretion. It is surprising that the words bail, bailable offenses, non-bailable offenses has been used as many as 103 times in the CRPC without a proper definition. So we always look at the schedule, the first schedule to the CRPC to see if an IPC offense is bailable or not. Now, decoding the first schedule to the CRPC. IPC offenses, one can go and look at whether it is bailable or not. We would see that categorization is not entirely rational. It's not that the offenses punishable with 7 years are non-bailable or less than 3 years are bailable. It is an arbitrary categorization. For example, offenses such as adultery, which does not stand on the statute books anymore, was punishable with 7 years but was still bailable. Criminal intimidation, and the second part, is punishable with the greater punishment but is still considered bailable. And 498A, on the other hand, which is punishable with 3 years, is considered non-bailable. So the categorization is not based on severity. Now the Law Commission is recommending that we should have a standard categorization, that offenses above 3 years, for example, would be non-bailable across the board for an easy understanding. What happens for non-IPC offenses? For the non-IPC offenses such as NDPS, UAPA, MACOCA, SC/ST Act, you look at the statute to see if they are bailable or non-bailable. If there is nothing in the special statute also, then we fall back on part 2 to the first schedule, which gives us a formula. Anything punishable with more than 3 years is non-bailable, less than 3 years is bailable. Now, this is a broad distinction on a regular and anticipatory bail. I need not delve on this much. We all understand. Only one thing I would emphasize is that anticipatory bail is an immunity not from arrest, but from custody. These are the four, just to recapitulate, these are the four cases where bail is mandatory, where the offense is bailable, where the applicant has undergone half of the sentence and the offense is not punishable with death or life. Third, where the investigation is not completed within 60 or 90 days. And fourth, where the trial before the magistrate is not concluded within 60 days. Some of the cases where bail is mandatory. A few quick words on bailable offenses. A question usually comes up, can you impose a condition for a bailable offense? The answer is no, except asking for sureties. No other condition can be put in a bailable offense such as 138 or any other bailable offense. However, if the accused is indigent and is unable to furnish bonds, a personal bond release is always possible. As a matter of prudence, sometimes we try to seek local and solvent sureties, but that's not a mandate of law. Sureties outside the state may also be accepted. Sureties now have to give a declaration that they are not professional sureties, and they have stood sureties in a number of cases, and they have to specify that number. You can always accept a cash deposit instead of a bond. That's possible. Can the investigating officer of the court impound a passport for a bailable offense? The answer is no. Can the condition that the accused will not travel beyond the state be imposed in a bailable offense? The answer, I'm afraid, is again no. For bailable offenses, no such conditions can be imposed. A very interesting question arises in the case where the offense initially is a bailable offense, but later becomes aggravated to a non-bailable offense. Now, what is to be done in such a case? A simple example may be if the accused was driving a vehicle and ends up killing somebody due to rash and negligent driving of the vehicle. He's initially charged for 304A of the IPC, which is bailable, and the police has granted him bail. But as the investigation progresses further, the investigating officer realizes that this is not a case of 304A. The person, the accused, intended to kill the deceased. They had a previous enmity, and the charge really should be of murder. Now, what is the IO to do in such a case? Can he consider the charges to have been aggravated and make an arrest for the non-bailable offense, regardless of the earlier order? Or is he required to approach the Honorable Court and ask for a cancellation of the earlier bail and to arrest him thereafter after the bail is cancelled? I would come to it a little later. The answer simply is that no. If the person is released for a bailable offense earlier, then the bail has to be cancelled. The IO cannot make an arrest himself. It's only after the bail is cancelled by the court under 437 subsection 5 or 439 subsection 2 that the IO can make an arrest for the new aggravated charge. This is 436A, fairly simple, half of the maximum. If the person has undergone as an under trial and it's not a very serious offense, shall be released on bail in that case. I think committees are also constituted to look at jails and try to find out people who've served half sentences. The next topic is default bail. very vexed area, uh, also known as statutory bail or compulsory bail. When can it be granted? If the investigation is not completed within 60 or 90 days, the period of 60 or 90 days may be extended by special statutes. For example, NDPS provides 180 days, which is further extendable to 1 year. Although the application has to be filed within 180 days, on the expiry of 60 or 90 days or 180 days, an indefeasible right accrues in favor of the accused to get bail. Now, what is the rationale? Although CRPC otherwise nowhere provides the time limit for investigation, the rationale of default bail is to deter delays in investigation and to act as a pressure on the police officer to complete investigation in a specific period of time. Now, how is this period to be computed? There's been huge controversy about something as technical as that. For that, we have the state of MP versus Rustam, which basically invokes General Clauses Act and says that in computation of the 60 or the 90-day period, 1 day has to be excluded. Usually the day of grant of remand, whether police custody or judicial custody, the first remand, that day is excluded, and the next day is taken as the first day. This is also reiterated by the Supreme Court in the 2015 case. Now, there was a huge controversy on what happens and how do you compute if whether the period is 60 or 90 days in IPC offenses. That has been conclusively answered in the case of Rakesh Kumar Paul, where it gives a very simple formula that the period after which default bail kicks in is 90 days, where the offense is punishable with death or any lower sentence, or where the offense is punishable with life, or where the offense is punishable with a minimum of 10 years. In all other cases where the sentence is 10 or less, the period is 60 days. There were conflicting judgments, but this judgment conclusively resolves the matter. There is one more thing that's very important, which the judgment says in para 40, that if the judge clearly sees that 60 or 90 days have expired and the accused is entitled to default bail, but the accused, due to lack of knowledge or lack of good assistance, does not file a written application, then the judge can consider an oral request as well and go on to grant bail. There is no need for a specific written application invoking default bail. And in matters of personal liberty, a technical approach should be avoided. So in all cases, the judge can give it suo motu as well. Now, another interesting thing happens on relay custody. We understand on 60 or 90 days, the expiry, person becomes entitled to bail. Sometimes investigative authorities do a lot of, trickery and creative things in order to overcome or bypass that bar that's there. Let's visualize the situation. Custody in X case, which is under the Prevention of Corruption Act or IPC, is given for 15 days as police custody, then 75 days in judicial custody. The accused undergoes 90 days custody in the primary offense, for example, of illegal gratification or cheating or criminal breach of trust. Now, what happens is, because most of these socio-economic offenses also amount to offense under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which is an independent offense, what the agencies do is, first they would take the person in custody. The regular police would take the person in custody for 90 days in the main offense. And after it expires or before it expires, the same accused is taken into custody in another case, which is under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, although the case is based on the first case only. For example, in this case, the money laundering case is nothing but the earlier case, because the offense of money laundering says nothing but that if you have acquired some property through cheating or bribery, that is proceeds of crime. And when you try to launder it, you try to reintroduce it to the formal economy, you try to conceal it, then you are also committing. So what happens is they take custody for 90 days in the main offense, then another 60 days in the PMLA offense. I call it relay custody. So it's almost like the regular police after doing it for 90 days. And just to ensure that the person doesn't get bail, ED then comes in and takes the person in custody. Now, there are huge problems with an approach like this. If the person has been in custody and the person was being interrogated, and the transaction is the same, the case is the same, the facts and evidence is the same, then both the agencies could actually take information from the accused within that period itself, instead of taking a relay custody in most of the cases. So, for example, in this test case, the total custody before the accused became entitled to default bail turned out to be as many as 150 days. Now, the questions that we need to think on is, what is the legitimacy of this practice? Now, the simple answer may be that yes, both the agencies are separate. They are entitled to arrest and take custody separately. However, when the facts and the evidence is same, is it a good practice? Is it something that should be encouraged? Is something I'll leave open for discussion. Now, what can be the possible objections from the defense? We have taken objections in cases like those, where what we do is, when the person is arrested for the first offense, the corruption offense, we move an application that we also want to surrender in the PMLA case that is underway, so that I can be taken into custody in both the cases at the same time, and so that the period of custody as an under trial gets satisfied in both the cases. But then again, that is a matter of discretion of the court and the investigative body. The body may say, enforcement directorate may say, no, we would take you in custody after the regular police or CBI has investigated the main offense, and we'll take you into custody only thereafter. But in some cases, the second agency ends up saying, no, we don't want custody. And if they say that, then taking custody for them thereafter becomes very, very difficult. Now, the next question that I would really want everyone to think about is the possibility of relay custody in normal IPC cases. Whether after taking custody, can the investigating officer, so we all understand that police custody can be taken only for the first 15 days and not thereafter. Can the investigating officer, in order to extend the period of police custody, keep on adding new sections to the existing FIR in order to take additional custody? The answer to that is no. The Supreme Court in CBI versus Anupam Kulkarni has really deprecated this practice of trying to add more sections in the same FIR, in the same transaction, in order to keep extending the period that of police custody. However, the court says, if there is a new offense that comes up, which is a totally different transaction, then the bar does not apply. For example, the accused is in custody for a cheating case with respect to one project. For example, he's a builder who's taken money from a lot of home buyers and has not delivered on his promises and had made false promises. Now, if this accused is in police custody in FIR number 1, but it turns out that he's done the same thing for many of his projects, and those are different transactions, then of course, the police can take police custody in each of those cases separately. The other interesting situation comes up is that when the police, in order to defeat the right of default bail, files an incomplete police report in order to say investigation is over, no more default bail. At that point, I think your discretion and your wisdom as a judge comes up, where you can actually refuse to accept that police report and say, no, this is not a good or adequate police report, and the accused is entitled to default bail. For example, in many cases, the IO would not file the statements of the most important witnesses, not get those recorded in a 164, would not seize the fruits of crime or the weapon of the crime, and does not do basic investigation. In that case, the court is fully within its powers to reject that police report, saying that it does not satisfy the ingredients or the requirements of 173 of the CRPC, and still give on the benefit of default bail to the accused. However, if the police report is substantially complete and the police has only reserved the right to investigate further in 173 subsection 8 of the CRPC, then the court can accept that police report and deny the right of default bail if it is filed in 60 or 90 days. But that's important in some cases. For example, the Visra report or the FSL report usually takes a very long time to come in. And if we say that the charge sheet is not complete without the Visra report, then we are essentially prejudicing the investigating agency and not understanding ground reality. So it's a very circumstantial test that you would do at the relevant point of time. In Dinesh Dalmia, the Supreme Court said that just because further investigation is pending does not mean that you would not give default bail if primarily and basically the investigation has got completed and only certain parts are remaining. The interesting situation happens when the accused has availed of the right of default bail on the expiry of 60 or 90 days, and the bail application is not decided for whatever, and then the charge sheet comes in. In that case, does the accused right get defeated? The answer to that is also no. If the bail application has come up first, the accused has successfully availed the right, and a subsequent filing of the charge sheet would not take away that right. This was said by the three judges bench in Uday Mohanlal Acharya. Right of default bail is not defeated by filing of charge sheet subsequently. However, there is a small caveat to this. If the accused has filed a bail application for default bail, court has granted bail, but the accused does not comply with the conditions, in that case, a filing of charge sheet may defeat that right. Now, does 167 of the CRPC apply in special cases like the Customs Act? Again, the answer is yes. Section 4 of the CRPC, I think, provides that CRPC also special laws unless its application is excluded specifically. Now, default bail under special statutes. Some special statutes provide for a longer period. NDPS 180 days, UAPA days again, MACOCA maybe 180 days. But in all these cases, the investigating officer should file the application for extension of time for investigation within the original period. Now, what happens? The COVID situation has led to interesting questions as to whether this period of a lockdown would be excluded in counting the 60 or the 90 days. For instance, somebody is arrested right on the day of the first lockdown, and the entire period of 60 days got exhausted in the lockdown, and no effective investigation could be done by the IO. Is the IO entitled to excluding that period, or the accused would become entitled on 61st day just as usual? So on this, we already have a conflict of opinion. As a backgrounder, the Supreme Court, as we all know, on the 23rd of March passed an order extending periods of limitation across the board. Now, the question was whether this Supreme Court order extending the period of limitation for pretty much everything, does that apply to default bail as well? Now, this has been answered by a single judge of the Madras High Court in Sethu's case, where the court says that when you have a power to arrest and when that power has been exercised in the lockdown, then why should the accused not be entitled to the set off of that period or the benefit of that period? If you're making arrests, then you should also extend that benefit. Otherwise, don't even make arrests in that period if it is a complete lockdown. That's one reasoning. The second leg of the reasoning is that 167 subsection 2 does not provide for any period of limitation for investigation. Therefore, the order of the Supreme Court doesn't help, because it only helps where there's a period of limitation. Here, there's no period of limitation. Essentially, the court in this case has taken a pro personal liberty approach and extended the benefit, it being a more beneficial provision. Uttarakhand High Court has also opined on similar lines, but there is a contrary view by the Madras High Court itself, another single judge decision, where the court has said that the period of limitation for investigation would stand extended, keeping in view the extraordinary situation, and the accused cannot claim default bail by taking advantage of the situation where there are fetters on the investigative agency upon their right of movement. Now, the reasoning seems to be that you cannot expect an IO also to go out there, investigate the case. He's also as human as everyone else. And why should we put him in the harm's way? And when there is no effective investigation, can you on that technicality release an accused who may be in there for a very, very serious offense? These are two very compelling logics. Now the division bench in Madras is going to finally settle the law on this in view of these conflicting judgments. So this is certainly not the last of this that we've seen. I'm sure there would be more developments here. I would request you to keep putting on your questions in the Q&A, and I would take them topic-wise. Cases where bail is discretionary, 437. Now, there seems to be a huge misconception that under 437, and I was talking to a bunch of IPS officers recently on bail itself, and there seems to be a misconception that 437 of the CRPC does not empower a police officer to grant bail in a non-bailable offense, and it is only the court who can. But if we look at the language of 437 subsection 2, it clearly provides that the officer concerned can also grant bail. Officer in charge of a police station can grant bail. And please let me say that I'm not opining one way or the other whether officers should grant bail in very serious cases or very heinous offenses. It's a question that I'm just putting out there. CRPC on its face does not appear to bar a police officer granting bail in a non-bailable offense. I also looked at the select committee and the legislative history. It clearly was the intention to give police officers also the right. But I don't see a lot of cases or any cases reported, in fact, where a police officer has exercised that power and the court has come in to review the exercise of that power. I would be happy to take in your experiences on this, just to put it out there. Jurisprudentially, the officer also can, and the court. How to exercise the discretion, all understand two conflicting interests have to be balanced very, very carefully, reasons to be recorded. Now, what are the considerations? We all know this. Just to quickly recapitulate, prima facie case, what do you look at? Severity of the punishment, danger of the accused, absconding or fleeing, character, behavior, antecedents. When we say the accused has roots in the society, unimpeachable antecedents, the witnesses can be tampered with, the danger of abscondence, of running away from the process of law, nature and the gravity of charge. So all of these are broad considerations, very carefully summarized in the case at the bottom. So this accused seems to have been denied bail on the ground of being a flight risk. Gravity of the offense. Now, gravity is something that has been a cause of huge contention. Gravity is certainly one of the considerations at the time of grant of bail, but it is never the sole consideration for grant or refusal to bail. Because when you take gravity of the offense or the socio-economic impact of the offense as a ground for denial of bail, it's almost like prejudging the issue in a lot of cases and opining on the merits of the case. This does turn the presumption of innocence on its head slightly. So gravity of the offense is to be taken as one of the factors and as a subsidiary factor and not the primary factor. Economic offenses may be grave, but if otherwise the accused is worthy of bail in terms of not being a flight risk, not tampering with the evidences, not interfering with the witnesses, then the person should be granted bail. This was laid down recently in the case of P. Chidambaram versus ED, where the court said, no, other factors are in favor of the accused. He's not going to run away. He's participated in the investigation. Let's not deny him bail just because the allegations are serious. Another interesting issue that got discussed in this case was whether it is okay for the investigating officers to pass on information to the court in the form of sealed envelopes or in sealed envelopes. The court deprecated such a practice. It said that when you are using certain facts and grounds for denial of bail, then it is appropriate and it is only proper that the accused should also get an opportunity to rebut. The court has clearly not outlawed the practice. It can still be done, but the court says it should not be done as a matter of course, as a matter of routine, and only in very grave cases of very, very sensitive information can it be given to the court in a sealed envelope. So in appropriate cases, if you think that the investigators are keeping the information from the accused, you can use this judgment to say, no, this is not a case where you use a sealed envelope. Please give the information to the accused also. Bail is usually granted liberally in cases of documentary evidence, clearly, because no custodial interrogation is needed in such cases. A couple of citations on that point. Now, what is cooperation in investigation? As a defense counsel, day in and day out, I see the prosecutors saying that the accused has not cooperated in the investigation and should be denied bail. Now, no court has defined what cooperation really is. We have the judgment of the Delhi High Court in Samrat Singh Nirula's case, where the court says that just because the police feels that custodial interrogation is needed does not mean that you would grant bail. Custodial interrogation is sometimes a mere euphemism for torture. Now, very, very powerful words there by the Delhi High Court, that you should not give custodial interrogation because more often than not, it is used as a form of torture. We should guard personal liberty very, very jealously. Santosh versus State of Maharashtra Supreme Court judgment is also very interesting on cooperation. It says that merely because the accused does not confess or does not give a statement as the police wants him to, it cannot be said that he is not cooperating with the investigation. Leave you with these citations. Refusal of bail, some case laws, if you think of what can situations and what are the case laws that can help you. Maruti Navale's case was a case of socio-economic fraud. The court said custodial interrogation is necessary. It's a large-scale fraud. Documents have to be recovered. It's a huge conspiracy. We need to look into it closely. And police custody was granted. Niranjan Singh is another landmark case on grant of police custody and denial of bail. This was a case where an SHO was accused of an offense and the case was being investigated in the very police station. And the court felt that in this case, the investigators may be influenced. In socio-economic cases, 420, PMLA, Prevention of Corruption Act, please feel free to use Jagan Mohan Reddy and Rohit Tandon's case, where the court says that economic offenses constitute a class apart and bail applications in such cases warrant a different and a more stricter approach. Now, I personally don't subscribe to that view in totality, but you may use these judgments in order to deal with economic offenses a little distinctly. Neeru Yadav is another Supreme Court judgment where antecedents were examined and the bail was denied. Then another Allahabad High Court judgment where, and there are many judgments on this, that if just because some other accused has been granted bail does not mean that the main accused also becomes entitled to bail. If their cases are different, if the circumstances are different, if the evidence against him is different. So just to arm you with the necessary case law again to deny bail in specific cases. Now, Section 439, where should one go, empowers both the Sessions Court and the High Court. Where should the person go? This may be interest to the Sessions courts out there. Where should one go first for bail, Court of Session or the High Court? The answer is they have concurrent jurisdiction, but Court of Sessions should be the court of first resort as a matter of propriety, and also as a matter of strategy for a lawyer, because then you have two bites at the same apple. Transit bail is another interesting case, and I'm just highlighting the broad features. You know all of this already. If it is after arrest, then Section 79 to 81 talk about it, where if a police officer is making an arrest outside his jurisdiction, then he has to take the accused to the jurisdictional executive magistrate or judicial magistrate for a transit remand. And that chief judicial magistrate or the Court of Session under 81 of the CRPC can also grant bail, which is usually known as transit bail. Now, another interesting issue is anticipatory transit bail. For example, an offense is registered in Delhi, but somebody is seeking anticipatory bail there in J&K on the ground that the person resides in J&K and apprehends arrest there. Can the court in J&K grant that anticipatory bail or not? Now, on this, we have very, very conflicting views. The first view is the Patna High Court view, where the court says that the application can be filed only before the court where the matter is registered, the FIR is registered. And the court says that 438 uses the word the court and not a or any court. Therefore, the reference is only in 438 of the CRPC to the court which is seized of the matter, which is the jurisdictional Court of Sessions. Delhi High Court has taken a very expansive view where bail is granted and the court thinks that if the accused is a bona fide resident of that state, then the court can go on to grant bail. And even if the FIR is in a different state, because the idea is to protect personal liberty. There is a third view, which is a view that I personally favor, which is a middle path where you give the person transit anticipatory bail for a limited time, enabling the person to go and seek bail before the jurisdictional court, because that jurisdictional court is more equipped to decide the question of bail better, because they have the whole facts before them. They would have the investigating officer, they would have the case diary. So it's better for you to give only a limited protection and then let the accused seek the proper anticipatory bail from the concerned court. Supreme Court is yet to definitively settle the law on this. Moving further, a few other case laws on transit bail. I'll leave you with that. What happens? This is a peculiar situation. What happens in a case where the accused is not arrested during the investigation by the IO, but it is a non-bailable offense? He files the charge sheet. The court takes cognizance. Can now, when the person appears in response to the summons, can he be taken into custody and sent behind the bars? Now, that is a question. There are two views. One view was that the person not having been arrested at the time of investigation, that itself is a very, very strong ground for bail, and the person should be granted bail because he's no more a threat to the investigation. Investigation is complete. His guilt has not been established. Please grant him bail. This is a view that court on its own motion versus CBI, the Delhi High Court judgment, where the court puts a duty on the court to release a person on bail if he's not been arrested during investigation. And this by itself is taken ground or taken as a conclusive factor for grant of bail. This judgment was also widely circulated to the trial courts and is being followed. It has recently also found some favor with the Supreme Court judgment that if the accused was not arrested during the investigation, when that person had the best opportunity to tamper with the evidence or influence witnesses, and the IO did not find it necessary to arrest, a strong case should be made out for placing that person in judicial custody after the charge sheet is filed. So the Delhi High Court seems to suggest that the person can ask for bail in such a case as a matter of right. The Supreme Court takes a slightly more diluted position where they say it makes out a very strong case, and the burden is on the IO to say, or the prosecutor to say, why do you need custody now? Successive bail applications, we all know, just recapitulating, you can file as many number of bail applications, and res judicata doesn't apply to bail applications, but there has to be a material change of circumstance and not a mere change of law or counsel or a mere change of argument. Another interesting aspect of successive bail applications is that normally successive applications should be placed before the same judge who decided the earlier bail application or denied the earlier bail application. Otherwise, it leads to a lot of forum shopping and bench hunting, where some people construe a particular bench as more liberal and the other as more inclined not to grant bail, and they strategically file bail applications keeping in mind the bench. The Supreme Court judgment in 2019 says it should be placed before the same judge as far as possible. Now, what are the conditions that the prosecution normally insists on? Cooperation with the investigation, restriction on traveling abroad. Now, a court cannot impound a passport, but the court can definitely impose a condition that the accused would not travel outside. Impounding of passport is something that only the passport authority can do under the Passports Act. But the condition can be put: refrain from contacting the witnesses, undergo rehabilitation or medical treatment. Surety should be verified in appropriate cases, not always. If the offense gets aggravated, for example, death in a case of hurt, then the bail order shall stand cancelled automatically, can be another condition that the prosecution may insist on. Accused would normally say that the bail amount should not be excessive. The person should maintain employment or should not commit to the offense again. The condition should be commensurate broadly. Now, these are some conditions which have been put recently, which may not be very, very conducive. Direction to deposit certain amount in X fund or download X app on the phone as a precondition for bail may not be tenable under the law. Arrest made for writing an offensive post and the person being asked to distribute 5 copies of a religious document may not be a correct condition to put in a charge of sedition, talking a lot about nationalism and asking the accused not to do anti-national slogans may not be a proper condition because it is too subjective. Condition of making remarks about the victim and her character in a bail order, again, not appreciable. Condition of planting a certain number of trees as a condition for bail may not be a good condition because the condition of bail has to have a nexus with the concept of bail. Normally, it is to prevent the investigation from being impeded or from the accused, to prevent him from running away from the law. A condition such as doing community service, planting trees, distributing blankets looks like a punitive condition and not a proper condition. A condition for apologizing for a tweet, condition of depositing money with the court, uh, condition of not saying anti-national things, which may be subjective, are all conditions which may not be appropriate conditions. Or for example, the condition of marrying the complainant in a domestic violence case or a sexual assault case. Now, I understand in a lot of rape cases, the complainant and the accused would settle the case. In appropriate cases, they go to the Honorable High Court to seek quashing of the FIR. Now, that can certainly be done. But condition in a bail in a rape case that you marry the complainant, otherwise the bail would get stand cancelled, may not be an appropriate condition. And these conditions I've taken from recent cases, uh, which is open to challenge. Now, I'll just quickly skip this. The broad condition for cancellation of bail, which is under 437 subsection 5 and 439 subsection 2 may be the following: misusing the liberty, failure to appear before court, interfering with the course of investigation, committing acts of violence, attempt to tamper. Fresh evidence has come up which shows that the accused is guilty, threatening witnesses, and all of those things. These are all standard things that we are all aware of. I would not delve on this further. I was earlier talking about a situation, and this is, I think, where we'll stop and I'll open it up to questions and discussions. What happens if the person initially is granted bail in a bailable offense or is granted bail for a particular section, but the later offense becomes much more aggravated? In that case, can the IO straight away arrest, or is the IO required to go to the court and seek cancellation? The court in this 2019 judgment says that in this case, the IO cannot straight away arrest. He has to approach the court has to cancel bail, and then only the arrest can be made. Now, just Mr. Gupta, do you think this is a good time to take questions given the
Yes. Thank you very much. I think you have layer by layer exposed whole of the procedure for grant of bail and the practice which is being adopted in court. You have touched upon all the points. Now we have received a few very important questions. First is from Mr. Sanjay Parihar. If accused has been arrested much before COVID-19 pandemic and during lockdown statutory period has expired, then can accused get benefit of default bail?
This is a very good question, Mr. Parihar. As I discussed earlier, there is clearly no clear guideline on this aspect. Different courts have opined differently. The question is whether the lockdown period, which may be 10 days in a case, or which may be 40 days in a case, or the entire 60 days in a case, can be excluded or not. You have two, single bench decisions opining differently. So you may take one of them which suits your reasoning also. And in the meanwhile, I'm sure we'll have a bigger bench conclusively deciding the issue.
This next question is from Ajay Kumar. How to deal with an application for cancellation of bail? Criteria you already have mentioned. When there is allegation of threat to witness, what is the reasonable amount of evidence material that can be insisted upon in support of such allegation?
Great question, Mr. Kumar. Thank you. In fact, we were doing this in a recent case where the allegation of the prosecution was that the witnesses are being tampered. The accused was considered a very influential person, but the court finally did not agree with the prosecution because it was just an allegation in the air. The court kept asking the prosecution if the witnesses are being threatened, where are those call records? Where are those DD entries? If somebody is being threatened and you get to know, you can register a case. 195A of the IPC specifically allows you to start a new case against the accused if he's influencing the witnesses. Where is all that material? You haven't produced anything, and we can't take it at your own face value and on your statement. CDR records, complaints, messages from the witnesses, the accused, CCTV footage of the accused going to the victim's house or the victim's office. All these can be good materials to show threat to witnesses as a ground for cancellation.
Next question is from Mr. Ashok Shawan. In anticipatory bail, is it necessary for the applicant to personally come to the court while on affidavit, or his counsel presence is sufficient?
Great question again. Thank you. First, on the part of affidavit, on this, the state practices are different. Some states insist on an affidavit, some don't. Now, on the question of personal presence, there is, I think, a proviso or a subsection to the section 438. I think it's 1A, which has not been notified, which said that if the prosecutor makes an application, so the general answer to this would be no. The applicant is not required to be personally present. As per 438, the counsel can come in and contest bail. And because there is a reason for this, because if the accused comes in and you deny anticipatory bail, then he can be taken into custody then and there. And then the purpose is sort of lost and the person is deprived of an opportunity to go to the higher court. So in such a case, personal presence is not needed. I know of only one state, that is the state of Maharashtra, which has notified a particular subsection, which says that if the prosecutor has moved an application asking for the accused presence, and the court thinks that the presence in this case is necessary, the court can ask the accused to be personally present in the court at the time of final disposal of the application. Now, Maharashtra is the only state that has notified it. There was a provision in 438 also that was recommended, but never notified. The Law Commission recommended that it should never be notified, and that seems to have prevailed. So no need for a personal presence. Sir, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, can you hear me now? In default bail, if PP comes with an application that the offense alleged to have been committed is very serious, punishable with death or life imprisonment, and certain reasons are given for not allowing the accused to avail default bail, can the court deny right of default bail to the accused?
Great question again. I'm afraid not. The section 167 subsection 2 proviso is very, very clear. If the investigation is not completed in 90 days, then the bail has to be granted, no matter how serious the allegations are.
This is question from Fozia Pal. Kindly elucidate circumstances wherein bail can be cancelled. I think you already have dealt with this aspect. Still, you can, if you want to add something.
Broadly, a circumstance where it can be cancelled has to be a post-bail circumstance. A court cannot cancel bail on the ground that it should not have been granted in the first place because it was not a good enough case. It can always be cancelled only on a post-bail circumstance. I have articulated about 15-20 situations when it can be cancelled in my presentation, which would come to you. Broadly, tampering with the witnesses, trying to run away, not cooperating in the investigation, the offense becoming much, much more aggravated. For example, if it was only a case of hurt, which became a case of murder because the deceased passed away or the victim passed away, that's also a ground for cancellation.
Next question is from Yahya Firdos. Is there any provision in CRPC regarding word interim bail? In common parlance, we only see this regular bail, anticipatory bail, but no interim bail specific provision is there.
That's a great question again. Thank you. In one of the subsections of 438, the statute goes on to say that there is a provision of an interim bail. An interim bail essentially is when your anticipatory is filed and it is not disposed of one way or the other, because sometimes it takes a longer period. Then in the meanwhile, the court can grant interim bail within that anticipatory bail application. A particular subsection of 438, if you look at it, it goes on to say that yes, interim bail can be granted. I'll just point you out. I think, just give me a second. I think it's a proviso. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So you'll find that in 438. Next question, please.
Next question is from Khemraj Sharma. How long the bail in a theft case be withheld till the recovery of stolen items? Usually the courts write that the stolen items have not been recovered, so bail is denied. So is it a good practice?
So if you feel that, stolen items is something that the accused can get you to, or otherwise the evidence is there against him, then sometimes it is a good ground for grant of police custody, because investigation, and if nobody else knows about it, it is hidden at a place, then you would need police custody. But it should not be used indefinitely as a ground to keep extending police custody and thereafter judicial custody. For example, after the first 15 days of police custody, if the person has not got it recovered and now can only be in judicial custody for the next 45 days, then there is no point in keeping him indefinitely, because now, having exhausted 15 days in police custody, the police can in any event not take him and try to discover the property. So in those cases, it may be appropriate to grant bail.
This is a question from Mr. Suneet Gupta. Can the provision under section 167 CRPC be applied in case of juvenile also?
I'm sorry, I lost you. This is anticipatory bail in case of juveniles?
Section 167 benefit, can it be given to juvenile also? Because juvenile bail procedure is differently dealt.
Sure. So very good question. 167 per se does not apply to juveniles. Juveniles, if you look at section 12, I think, of the Juvenile Justice Act, talks about specifically on bail to juveniles in conflict with law, which is something that the JJB would do. And it says that bail should be the rule in every case against a juvenile, unless you think that the juvenile would come in contact with the bad elements, or he does not have a house, then only you keep him in an observation home. But otherwise, grant it liberally is what the JJBs have been asked to do. So I don't think the situation of a remand per se and grant of default bail would come up there, because the entire procedure is separate in JJB on how the children are kept in detention and how their bail is to be seen, which is to be very, very liberal. So section 12 JJB is going to answer that. A related question sometimes, if I could just extend it a bit, is anticipatory bail to a juvenile. Now that is again an issue on which many high courts have opined differently. Some high courts feel that anticipatory bail can be granted in case of a juvenile by the Sessions Court, because there is no bar under the JJ Act. Section 12 of the JJ Act, which is a self-contained code on bail to juvenile, only applies to the bail to the juvenile after he is apprehended. So, but on the other hand, there are some judgments that say JJ Act is a complete code. Only the JJB can deal with the juvenile and no other criminal court can. So 438 doesn't apply. Yeah, that's also pretty much open.
Question from Shafiq Malik. What should be the procedure for surrender bail?
Great question, Mr. Malik. This is a question that came up before the Supreme Court in Sandeep Kumar Bafna's case also in 2015. Now, if somebody is coming and surrendering, normally as a matter of practice, if the court does not have the facts before it, the court would seek the investigating officer to come and see what this is about, because it can come as a surprise to you. And when the IO comes up, the IO would of course explain what the case is about, and then one can allow the IO to take the person into custody and then produce him and then take it as a normal case. But now the situation is slightly more complicated, because after the 2015 decision of the Supreme Court and Sandeep Kumar Bafna, the accused can surrender not just before the magistrate's court, but also before the sessions court or the high court also, in fact. Now it is a bit of a gray area now how the sessions court or the high court would grant remand if after the surrender they do not want to release the accused on bail, because 167 per se is not a power that the sessions court or the high court normally has. But I think if you go on to read Sandeep Kumar Bafna, it deals with it in great detail. I think that is also going to address the question put to me by Mr. Wajahat Salam.
This is a question from Mr. Abdul Rashid Malik. The duty of the court at the stage of granting bail is not to weigh the evidence meticulously, but to arrive at a finding on the basis of broad probabilities. How does this hold good in cases where the court has to record a finding as to guilt of the accused before grant of bail, like in Unlawful Activities Act, NDPS Act, specifically Section 37 of NDPS Act?
Great question. In fact, I had a slide, two slides dedicated to this question. You are absolutely right. PMLA in Section 45, UAPA, NDPS, MACOCA, all these statutes play a higher burden on the accused to seek bail. At the stage of bail, the accused is obligated to convince the court that there are no reasonable grounds for believing that I have done the offense, and I would not commit the offense hereafter. And only once the accused is able to satisfy the court on such a higher threshold that the accused gets entitled to bail. I'm sure you are already aware that the Supreme Court has struck down that higher condition, at least in the case of PMLA. In Nikesh Tarachand's case, you would find that in my slide. In PMLA now, the standard is the same as a normal offense after the Supreme Court ruled on it. On the question of NDPS specifically, you are right, there is a higher standard. I know of one Punjab and Haryana High Court judgment in Ankush Kumar's case, Justice Sehrawat's judgment, which is also there in my presentation, where the court has taken a very creative stand, where the court has taken the logic of PMLA from Nikesh Tarachand and said, this is a very high standard for us to insist on at the time of bail, and this cannot be due process, this cannot be fair and reasonable, and I would go by that logic and not insist on a higher stand. So the Punjab and Haryana High Court has taken a very brave stand there, and it has not gone by the stricter threshold. There is also a Supreme Court judgment which slightly opines to the contrary. So this becomes a very, very vexed question. You would find similar provisions in Companies Act also, subsection 212, subsection 6, where for cases of fraud, a higher standard is there. Now, Delhi High Court seems to be tilting in favor of a lesser standard and interpreting it differently. You would find the case of Upendra Rai in my presentation, which can help you get some grounds to not go by the higher standard. Give you those options.
This question is from Mr. Sanjay Parihar. In the context of accused not having been arrested during investigation, the question says if it is because of collusion of accused and the IO, the accused is not arrested, and then charge sheet is presented. Can the bail be granted in that condition, or he should be sent to custody?
That's a great question. In fact, a reference was made by a Delhi court on this question itself. But in the response to the reference, I think the Delhi High Court went on to say that in such cases, you shall grant bail, because at the end of the day, if the IO and the accused are in collusion, and he hasn't been arrested during the investigation, still the investigation is complete. Now putting him behind the bars for the reason that there was a collusion is not something that is very conducive, because what is the purpose served by that detention? Denial of bail, as we were discussing earlier, is not something that is done by way of punishment or by way of, it is only something that goes on to aid the investigation. If at this stage now at charge or trial, keeping the accused with the police in custody is not going to serve any purpose, then you may not. But your concern is absolutely right. This is a judgment, I think, of a single judge of the Delhi High Court. You may also look at the Supreme Court judgment, which I discussed in my presentation, which says that normally, if the person is not arrested, you should grant him bail. But if you can record adequate reasons, please use the Supreme Court judgment to say that this is not a case where you go by the general rule. There are exceptional circumstances. But you would have to highlight very carefully in your order what is the need or the purpose that would be served at this point by keeping the accused behind the bars.
This is a very useful intervention made by Mr. Muhammad Yusuf Wani sir. He says section 41 of the Code of Criminal Procedure only enumerates the circumstances where police can arrest without warrant. The law does not mandate that arrest of a person has to be there. So he makes a reference of Apex Court's judgment in Siddharth Satlinga Mehtre versus State of Maharashtra. Your take on it?
Absolutely agree with sir. Arnesh Kumar also goes on to limit the powers of the police to arrest in cases without warrant. Very, very strict conditions are to be satisfied. A checklist has to be maintained by the IO as to why he needs custody. And why, after DK Basu and Joginder Kumar, we all understand that existence of power to arrest is one thing. The justification for its exercise is quite another. And in every case, you should have a justification. On Siddharth, SS Mehta's judgment, I'm glad sir mentioned. That's also very, very interesting, and that's there in my presentation. When I deal with anticipatory bail, the earlier view was that anticipatory bail should be granted till the end of trial. Thereafter, a few judgments came in that said, Abdul Samad's case, for example, which said that anticipatory bail should be granted only for a limited period of time, and the accused should be made to go and surrender before the regular magistrate and seek regular bail. But in SS Mehta's judgment, be granted. 5 judges bench of the Supreme Court has affirmed Mehtre as being correct. So yes, Mehtre is important for this point as well. You'll find all these judgments and the evaluation in my presentation.
This is a question from Mr. Akram Chaudhary. What could be the material change in circumstances for considering successive bail applications?
Excellent question. Normally, change of circumstance, which would be material, maybe, for instance, investigation stands completed. That is a good change in circumstance. In many cases, we immediately go to the court asking for bail after the charge sheet is filed, because as an accused, I'm no more needed to be in custody. That's one good circumstance. Second is, for example, during the investigation, certain evidences have come up which point to the involvement of a totally different person. For example, let's take the example of Arushi Talwar's case. At different points in that case, different people were the prime suspects. So, it would start with the servants, for example, and then it went on to the parents. So when, for example, if the servants are in custody and then they are the prime suspects, they are being subjected to narco analysis and everything. But later the CBI comes in and does a press conference, for example, and it says, no, now we have got very good evidences against the parents that they are the people behind the murder. In such a case where such material is there and the investigating agency has taken a stand that it is not X, but Y we are looking at, that may be a good change of circumstance. Spending a very long period of time, for example, somebody spends like 1 year after the last denial of bail may also be a good change of circumstance.
This is a question from Tarun Mahajan, our training officer. Whether magistrate can grant default bail in offences punishable with sentence of death or imprisonment for life, in view of restriction contained in Section 437, first part.
That's it again. 167 stand on its own legs, and the restriction in 437 subsection 2 or 437, this is 437 subsection 1, 1A, does not really control the power under 167. 167 is an absolute power, and the magistrate can grant default bail in that case.
Actually, this question also has another dimension. Would this default bail be granted by the magistrate or by the court which would try the offense later on?
Good point, sir. In this 167, it's clear that it's the court which is granting custody who can make that assessment or who can make that decision in that given case. But however, nothing stops the accused from invoking 439 separately, which is the Sessions Court power or the High Court's power. But I think in a 167, it should be the magistrate doing it, subject, of course, to correction.
Another question from Mr. Abdul Rashid Malik. What is the effect of presumption under Section 29 of POCSO Act on the bail plea of the accused?
Another excellent question, a question that we are grappling with every day. This presumption that you're talking about is a reverse onus that is there in most of the laws these days. We have one in NDPS, we have one in PMLA, which says that the mental state or culpable mental state of the accused would be presumed, and it is for the accused to prove his innocence, which is totally different from ordinary criminal jurisprudence. Now your question specifically is, at what stage does the presumption kick in? Do you have to give weight to the presumption at the stage of bail also? And if you do that, then in every case of bail, the accused would have to convince you of a very, very high standard, which is very difficult for the accused to do when the investigation is not complete, when he is not allowed to file his documents, lead his evidence. So on this, the general view is that a presumption is a creature of evidence and only comes into the picture at the time of trial, where you are actively examining where the burden of proof should be. A presumption, even if it is a mandatory presumption, a shall presume, that also does not kick in at the time of charge or any time before that. I know of only one decision in the entire country which goes on to throw light on this. That is Upendra Rai's decision of the Delhi High Court, where the court has categorically said that the prosecution may be entitled to a presumption, but the presumption comes into the picture only at the stage of trial and not at investigation. We would not burden the accused with a higher standard at that stage.
This question is from Mr. Ashok Shawan. In cases of bails, even in offences which can be conveniently taken up for bails by magistrates, the accused approaches session court directly, regardless of punishment. So how far it is legally justified?
Great question again. Thank you for that. 439, if you see, gives very, very wide powers to the High Court or the Court of Session to grant bail. So there is no restriction there. But as a matter of propriety, it should always be the court of first instance. We do not have anything in the CRPC similar to the CPC, where the CPC says you have to go to the court of the lowest instance or the first instance before you move upwards. But as a matter of practice, it is better. And I've seen Sessions Court orders denying bail and relegating the person to go and seek it before the learned magistrate.
This question is from Mr. Siddhant Vaid. If accused is arrested in offence X and is in police custody and the custody is changed in another offence Y of some other police station, then the days he was in custody in offence Y will be counted in offence X. So multiple FIRs in multiple police stations. So what is the appropriate way to deal with it?
Great question. So if the person remains in custody in FIR X, while he's in also custody for FIR Y, then the period would continue to run, and I don't think that would be excluded. So sometimes there would be a scramble between different police stations and different agencies on getting custody. Uh, Now they've become a little wiser, where, as I said, they do a relay sort of thing. One person takes custody in one case for 60, 90. Then the second agency comes in, or the second FIR comes in, and then you take another 60, and then you have a third FIR to take another 60. But in your example, if the person was formally arrested or taken into custody in FIR X, but thereafter taken to FIR Y, that period should be included in FIR X also. The person could have sought bail in X case and got released in one FIR, then it would not be counted.
Next question is from officers from Kathua district. If IU is in connivance with the accused, doesn't arrest him and files a faulty incomplete charge sheet, can the court send accused to judicial custody? Partly, I think it's a repetition of earlier question.
Yeah. So on connivance, we've already addressed. If it is an incomplete charge sheet, you can always refuse to accept it and say it is not proper as per 173. You're only filing it. You take it back. Or in any event, if you think it's a closure report, for example, or a police report that you do not agree with, you are not obligated to agree with. You have your own options. You can order a further investigation under 173.8, or now, in fact, even 156.3 after Justice Nariman's judgment last year. So you have the power. You have those three options. You can accept the report. You can order further investigation. You can still go on to take cognizance even on a closure report also. So you would have all those options. As far as custody is concerned, if the report has come in as an incomplete one, you can say it's not a good report and you can extend custody and say investigation. For example, if the report is not proper, then you would have to release on default bail again. But if you accept the police report and if you're keen that the accused should not get out, then it would be a good idea to accept the report, order for.
Am I audible?
No, yes.
So in that case, if you want to keep him in custody, then you accept the report for whatever it is, order further investigation on specific points, and then extend the custody under 309 of the CIPC, which gives extended power to the judge to extend remand the filing of charge sheet.
This question is from Miss Aarti. How long accused can be denied his right to default bail?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
The question says how long magistrate can deny right of default bail to the accused.
There is very little discretion available to the court in the matter of default bail. If the charge sheet is not filed in 60 or 90 days, then you shall release him on bail, and it is not possible for the court to continue to deny the accused. However, in special acts, for example, NDPS, where the period can be extended even beyond 180 days, the court can use its discretion to say, no, this is a complicated case of, for example, narcotics, which has border implications, and more time should be given to the investigator. I am extending the period. Then you can, in fact, deny bail for months altogether. It would depend on the statute you are dealing with, but in normal IPC cases, it may not be possible for you to exercise discretion.
This question is from Mr. Iqbal Rafiq. It deals with the Unlawful Activities Act. Remand by magistrate having no jurisdiction. His limit is to grant remand for 15 days. And it is extended to 30 days, can this be exercised by non-jurisdictional magistrate also?
That's a great question, but on that because UAPA remand issue is not something that I've looked at, but would be helpful if you could enlighten us in the section on what the position is.
For police remand, it doesn't talk about jurisdiction or non-jurisdiction, because remand is to be in, especially in cases of unlawful activities, Act with NIA Act. It gives special jurisdiction to the special court. So probably the context would have to be seen in this Unlawful Activity Act cases. This question is from Mr. Tabrez Qazi. What is the status of judicial detention of accused who being remaining off and on from trial and sent to lockup without cancelling his bail?
I'm sorry.
Can you hear? Can you hear, Mr. Bharat?
Yes, I can hear the question. I can also see this. This is at 29. What is the status of judicial detention of accused who being remaining off and on from trial and sent to lockup without cancelling his bail? I'm not sure of the intention behind the question.
During trial, that accused remains absent. We don't cancel his bail, but arrest warrant is issued. So in that situation, should the bail be cancelled and the person detained, or he be brought only on warrant?
So there's nothing that prohibits the court from taking somebody into custody who's violated the conditions of bail. In fact, even in bailable cases, 436 subsection 2 says that if a person has violated the conditions of bail, then the person is not entitled to bail as a matter of right anymore, even if the offense is bailable. And if that person is taken into custody, then I think that's a fair procedure.
Right. This is question.
Sir, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Sir, I couldn't hear the question. Which one are we doing?
The question asks about the scope of hearing victim or the complainant at the time of bail, especially in POCSO cases and serious cases against women.
That's an excellent question again. The complainant's locus standi has been a cause of huge controversy. I would lead you to the decision of Sandeep Kumar Bafna by the Supreme Court again. Just a moment, I would put it up on the screen. In fact, what in a nutshell Bafna's case says is that there is no vested right in the complainant or the informant to directly conduct a prosecution. The counsel of a private party can only assist the prosecution. The case may be, and that too, assistance can be done, and the counsel may be given a very limited hearing only if the case is at a very crucial or a critical juncture and when the prosecution is otherwise going to fail. Other than that, primarily it's the PP's responsibility. In practical terms, the complainants are given an opportunity. I think POCSO has special provisions. There is a Delhi High Court decision also of Miss G through her mother versus state, where there are specific directions that trial courts cannot grant bail in POCSO matters in the absence of the complainant. And I think there are special provisions within the Act also. Such provisions are also there in certain sexual assault cases and in the latest CRPC, where the presence of informant is obligatory at the time of bail hearing. I just put this, whatever just I said, in the chat form for everyone's benefit. So these are the things that you will look at. I've just put it in the Q&A section, the judgment and the relevant provisions. But long and short is limited role in normal cases only assist the prosecution. But in these special cases, there are specific directions for the complainant to be given a role. Sir, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
This is a question from Mr. Tausif Magre, pertains to Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So again, I would say that this has to be seen in the context of NIA Act, which makes UAPA as scheduled offense. So it has to be dealt by the special judge trying empowered under NIA Act. So the next question is from Mr. Anoop Sharma. Can the conditions of bail imposed by a superior court be modified by a subordinate court to whom the trial of the case is transferred, if the trial court is convinced with the plea of modification in the condition? If yes, any case law in support?
That's a great question again. The conditions of bail can usually be varied as per section 440 only. And I think it is only the High Court or the Court of Sessions who may direct that the bail required by a police officer or magistrate be reduced. So normally it's only those courts. So it would never be the magistrate or the trial court reducing the bail conditions. The bail conditions, again, is something that is very, very fluid. The court, according to the circumstances, can, but within the limitations of 440.
This question is in terms of section 437. Is there any power to the IO to release accused on bail in non-bailable offences?
Yes. So theoretically, the answer is yes. If you look at subsection 2, where it says if it appears to such officer or court that there are no reasonable grounds for believing that a person is guilty, he may release. So subsection 2, subsection 4 also says an officer or a court releasing any person on bail under subsection 1 or 2. So police officer very well can, but they don't do it for obvious reasons, for reasons of being checked in terms of their reasoning and the motivations by the court. So that is the reason they don't do it normally, but theoretically they can. Even the architects of CRPC envisage that the police should be granting bail in non-bailable cases.
This is a long question from Mr. Yahya Firdaus about this time limit of remand. Would it start from 12 o'clock, or which period of time it would start? From the date of custody or 12 o'clock? How to compute this day?
Great question. For example, if you're sitting today as the duty magistrate, Mr. Firdaus, and somebody is produced before you right after this video chat, and the person is produced within 24 hours, and you have granted 14 days today, then today's day would not be included, and tomorrow is going to be the first day, starting, of course, like a normal day starts, and that is, so one day is excluded, today is not going to be counted. So tomorrow, the whole day of tomorrow is going to be the first day for you, and thereafter.
This is question from Renu Dogra. There may be certain cases in which accused wants to surrender before the court, but because of COVID-19 situation, he is not able to do. Can it be done through virtual mode? The accused making presence through virtual mode and considering this to be surrender, the accused, can he be granted bail by the magistrate?
Interesting. So I think this situation, but it's very, very creative what you've just said, and something that we would be compelled to think about going forward, the way things are moving. But if you look at the scheme of 167, it talks about production initially. Thereafter, indeed, 167 goes on to say that the production can be through audio-visual mode, which is what really happens when you are extending remand, which is known as REVI. Always for the first appeal for magistrate, and only extensions can be offered. So I don't think, as in framework, e-surrender is that's a possibility.
And indirectly, I think the provision allows virtual surrender also.
I mean, if you look at it, there are certain judgments that say that you take an old provision and interpret it in light of the new technological developments. If one can try to fit it in somewhere, then there may be a way. But explanation 2 is interesting for you to see.
Tabassum Wani, when interim bail has been granted to the accused and he doesn't turn up to the court, whether bail is to be cancelled then or application dismissed and accused.
Great question. Because interim bail is not structured, in a formal fashion. Normally, an interim bail would take the form that till the next date of hearing, the accused may not be arrested or shall not be arrested, or the investigating officer may be given would be giving an undertaking that I would not arrest. If that is how it is structured, and there are no bail bonds given by the accused, it's only a stay of arrest, so to speak. Then in that case, you can just dismiss the application and take away that interim protection. However, if the interim bail has also been granted by acceptance of bail bonds and proper formal procedure, then you would have to go in for a cancellation. But that would not be a situation in most of the cases, because in most of the cases, the order is structured by saying that there shall be interim protection from coercive process till the next date of hearing.
This question is from Mr. Javed Rana. In case of accused, surrender of accused, exact offence is not known. What course should be adopted by the magistrate? Whether to send him to judicial custody or to police custody or some other mode, what is the appropriate course to be followed?
Great question of practical. You do not know about the case, then it's very difficult for you to make that assessment. Very important to get your IO, your SHO to come and explain what the case is about. The person may want to get into custody to just defeat the right of police custody, because if he stays on in judicial custody for more than 15 days and the first 15 days are over, then the person may not be granted police custody. So he may have some other ulterior motive at the back of his head. Work very closely with him, understand what this is, and take an appropriate. In most cases, filing an application, the IO would come, arrest the accused, and seek the appropriate custody as the case requires.
This is very pertinent question from Mr. Jahangir Bakshi. It says, if the bail has been granted by the magistrate in ignorance of any special provision which bars grant of bail, should the magistrate cancel bail, or this would be left to be taken up by the special court?
Good question. It would be an appropriate case for cancellation per se, because it is not a circumstance that has come up after the grant of bail. This essentially is a matter of incorrect legal reasoning in the first place. So ideally, the state should take it up. Prosecution should take it up before the Sessions Court or before the High Court in a 482 or some or the other remedy. And that is how it should come before the Superior Court. If the special court becomes seized of the matter itself, then special court also may exercise its power. For example, or challenge the order sessions, some
other. This question is from Mr. Sunil Kumar. Can magistrate grant bail with respect to an offence exclusively tribal by the Sessions Court in IPC offences?
That's a great question. 437 doesn't place any bar on the magistrate's power to grant bail in sessions offences. However, you may read the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in Prahlad Singh Bhati's case, where the Supreme Court said that in very, very serious offences which are sessions tribal, the magistrate should take a step back and do it with circumspection and caution and prudence, and may not choose to grant bail. But technically, there is no bar. The bar only comes up when it is very clear to the magistrate under subsection 1 of 7 that there are multiple grounds to believe the offence.
Hello.
That is the bar, but otherwise, sessions, no bar, but a rule of prudence, be a little more circumspect. Prahlad Singh Bhati.
Another question from Mr. Ashok Shawan. In a case with charges both under POCSO and under Section 376 IPC, whether charges are to be framed for both offences or either of these offences. I think this is a little away from the topic of discussion because we are discussing bail topic, but still if you want to say anything on it.
So the special court is also empowered, I think, to take care of related IPC offences as well. And if it is the same transaction, your principles of Section 221, 222 of the CRPC would kick in, and charges can be joined if they emanate from the same act or the same transaction. I don't think there's an impediment. Can't hear you, sir. Sorry.
Yes, I think we have taken sufficient number of questions, and now the question which I think appearing on screen are repetition of earlier queries. So probably we can end here. This had been a very great discussion and good questions posed, and probably all have been effectively answered by you. So thank you very much. Your interventions in this discussion, your presentation has been wonderful enlightenment, and whatever we had in our minds, that gets refreshed. Many new things also learned. So thank you very much, and hope to see you in some other programs for which we would make request to you. So thank you very much for your enlightening all our officers, and I would thank all our officers who have joined discussions and have posed very good questions for benefit of all other participants also. So thank you very much. See you in some other webinar organized by the Academy. Thank you very much. And yes, I just missed one point. We were joined by Mr. Baljinder Singh Sara. I recognize his presence, and he is a faculty member from Chandigarh Judicial Academy. Very kind of him in joining, and in other programs also. Members, faculty members and directors from the Chandigarh Judicial Academy have been joining us. This is very encouraging for us. Thank you, Mr. Baljinder Singh Sara. Thank you once again to all of the participants and to you, Mr. Bharatji. Thank you very much.
Thank you.